Hi guys, welcome back to the Mina Does Art Stuff YouTube channel. My name is Mina and on this channel we do art stuff. Today I thought I would share with you my Daniel Smith Watercolour Collection. I have this sort of quote-unquote master palette where I keep a half pan, except for one. I keep a half pan of all the different colours that I've ever owned of the Daniel Smith colours. I don't still own all the tubes for all of these. And some of them I never had tubes in the first place. It's a bit of a long story, but essentially a few years ago, back when I first started painting with watercolours, I would look on eBay a lot to get secondhand tubes of paint that people no longer needed, and it would be a lot cheaper than buying them brand new. Also saved them from going to waste. And I managed to win this massive sort of job lot of Daniel Smith watercolor paints. I think there was something like 80 tubes and a selection of half pans. I believe the person selling them had the Jane Blundell's like mixing set of 15 pans, and there was a few other pans in there as well. And yeah, and you know, so there was lots of duplicates within the tubes as well, lots of earth tones and lots of blues that were duplicates. So what I did was I sort of went through them all, swatched them all out, decided which ones I wanted to keep, and then the ones that were duplicates and or I didn't need to keep hold of, I then resold and passed them on to new homes, again where they would be used, because I didn't need to keep 3 tubes of French ultramarine in my stash. So, but I've maintained this kind of like I said, a master palette of all the different colours I've ever owned, and anytime I add a new Daniel Smith colour to my collection, I add a half pan of it to this palette as well, just so that I have a record of everything that I've got here. And I thought I have 71 paints technically, if you want to count the original Queen Gold, which is this little dab of it down here. And I thought I would go ahead and swatch it all out, and I've created space so I can do some nice big swatches, and hopefully we'll be able to really see how these granulate or look in various concentrations of the wash. Unfortunately it's a really grey day today, so even though it's daytime I have to have my lamp on just for some additional light, so hopefully this will be okay. If you hear any wind gusting, that's because it's gusting outside, and I may end up breaking up this video into 2 parts just because there's a lot of paints to go through. Like I said, there's 71. For the chatty real-time talking as I'm going along video, it will probably be broken up into 2 parts, and then I'll do a sped up time-lapse version which is just set to music for anyone who just wants to listen, wants to just watch and not listen to me yammer on. I'll also be talking about the pigments and the names and pigment properties, etc. as we go along, and yeah, so hopefully that will be interesting for you guys. I will have links down below to where you can purchase these paints on Jackson's. It is an affiliate link, and all that means is I get a small commission. It doesn't cost you anything extra, but it's a great way to support the channel and support me for creating these videos. Otherwise, yeah, let's just jump into it. Yeah, okay, I'm going to zoom you guys in so you can really see what's going on the paper, but I wanted to sort of give you a look at the palette initially. But I'm going to move this over to the side so it's a bit easier for me to use. I'm going to zoom you guys in and let's get started. Okay, I forgot to add the paper I'm using is a sketchbook. It's Artway 35, so it's apparently 35% cotton. And the brushes I'm going to be using, I might be swapping between them, depends on how it goes. But I'll either be using this Da Vinci Colineo size 8 round brush or this small Romish small synthetic squirrel quill brush. Just going to see how it goes. I'll use either of these, and I haven't pre-wet the paints. I'm just going to wet them as I go along, so hopefully it's not too tedious. If it ends up being a little bit tedious, I might go ahead and spray the rest and see how we go. Okay, so first up we have Buff Titanium. Daniel Smith paints for the most part re-wet pretty well. There's a couple that I know coming up that are a bit harder to re-wet, but we'll deal with that later. So Buff Titanium is PW6:1. It's basically an unbleached titanium white. It is technically a granulating colour, but because it's such a light colour, it's not often noticeable, the granulation. And you can see it's sort of semi-transparent, semi-opaque. It's got a bit of body to it. It's not, well, obviously it's a white pigment, so it's not completely transparent. Then we have PW3, and mine seems to be a little bit contaminated, so I'm going to clean that off. PY3, Hansa Yellow Light. So this is the yellow that comes in the Daniel Smith sort of beginners like split primary set. I think they call it the Essentials set. It's a very common yellow pigment. Often a lot of brands refer to call this one lemon yellow. I don't know, it's not a yellow I use very often at all. Even I don't even have a tube of this pigment anymore. And then next up we have Daniel Smith's Lemon Yellow. This one I prefer to the Hansa Yellow Light. It's just ever so slightly, like a touch warmer, but not much. This is PY175. It's a very light, fast yellow pigment. I know there are some student grade brands or student grade paints that use this as their lemon yellow as well. It's a really lovely, bright, clean yellow. Next up we have Hansa Yellow Medium, PY97. I sort of prefer mid yellows, like slightly warmer yellows, personally, in my work. I don't know, I don't find I go for a lemon yellow that frequently, or at all. And yeah, I just prefer the warmer toned yellows. And I know you can mix a warmer tone yellow from a cool yellow, but like I would be constantly mixing the warm yellows, so I might as well have one to begin with. Next up is Nickel Azo Yellow. This is PY150, and if I was to only have one yellow on my palette, this will probably be the one I would pick, because it's very transparent. It has quite a dark mass tone, like you can see here. It's quite like a mustardy yellow colour. It's very warm in the mass tone, and then as you wash it out, it gets lighter and brighter. And so it can also work in place of a cool yellow in your mixing palette. So it can do both, the job of both yellows. And it's got a very, yellow tends to be quite a light tinting colour to begin with, but Nickel Azo Yellow is quite a strong tinting colour, and it's also got a very big value range. So you've got a big range from the mass tone to the wash, whereas in some of these lighter yellows there's not that much of a colour difference, if that makes any sense. Next up we have Chrome Titanate Yellow. This is a new one to my collection of Daniel Smith paints. And yeah, this is PBR24. Some brands call this Naples Yellow Deep. I think Roman Schmall, Winsor & Newton, Sennelier referred to this, call this pigment Naples Yellow Deep. I prefer it to a lot of traditional Naples yellow pigments because it doesn't have the white mixed in, although I don't mind having white in my paints so much these days. But I do like the richness of this one, and it does granulate quite nicely. It also moves quite a lot in wet water as well, wet washes. There we go. You can see a bit of that granulation coming up in the... I'll show you the swatches up close once they're all done. Okay. Next up we have Mars Yellow. This is another newer pigment to my collection. It's PY42. I've been trying to find an alternative to traditional yellow ochre that I enjoy using more. So I actually quite enjoy using this Mars Yellow. I almost use it similarly as I would use the Chrome Titanate Yellow, so I probably wouldn't have both on a palette at any one time, but I do like both pigments. The Mars yellow is a little bit more brown, I guess, in the mass tone than the chrome titanate yellow. And then next up we have yellow ochre, which is PY43. I think, if I'm not mistaken, PY42 is the natural yellow ochre pigment and PY43 is the synthetic yellow ochre pigment. I can't remember exactly if that's correct, but I think that's the case. And Daniel Smith's yellow ochre is fairly transparent compared to a lot of other brands. So if you're looking for a transparent yellow ochre, then you might want to check this one out. You can see compared to the Mars yellow, it's definitely a bit more transparent. And then we have raw sienna. This is PBR7. And I don't find I reach for raw sienna that often, if at all, really. Not that it's not a pigment I hate or anything. It's not like I dislike it. I just don't feel the need to have this many shades of the same sort of earth yellow on my palette. Again, it sort of feels the same sort of, for me anyway, it feels a similar role as yellow ochre / Mars yellow, although I'd say Mars yellow is a bit brighter, whereas the raw sienna is more of an orange undertone in comparison. But I would never see the need to have like all 4 of these colours on a palette. Maybe one would be more than enough for my purposes. But if you're maybe an animal painter or someone who paints with a lot of natural colours, you might need more nuance within your yellow browns on your palette. Okay, moving on to the other side. Make sure everything's on screen. Okay, we're going to start with New Gamboge over on this side, and this is the warm yellow included in the Daniel Smith Essentials set, and it's our first multi-pigment mix in this series. It's PY97, which is the Hansa Yellow Medium, with PY110, which, if I'm not mistaken, is Daniel Smith's Isowindolin Yellow. I believe that's that pigment or that colour. So if you have that one and the Hansa Yellow Medium on your palette, you can mix this colour yourself. Next up we have Aussie Red Gold, which I really love this colour. It's a 3 pigment mix, but I think it's pretty unique and interesting. It's made up of PY83, PR101 and PV19, and whilst I'm not a huge fan of traditional orange colours, I love these sorts of rusty, earthy orange tones. And this one, in certain uses, in certain situations, can granulate as well. I don't think it's marketed as a granulating colour, but it does have that PR101 in it, so I don't know which version of PR101 is included. But on some papers, in some situations, I've had this colour granulate. So I don't know if it'll do that here today, but we'll see. Next up we have Quinacridone Gold, and this is the hue version. So this is PO48 and PY150. So that's Quinacridone Burnt Orange and Nickel Azo Yellow. Again, very sort of dark and that sort of rusty orange colour in the mass tone, and then it washes out to a lovely golden yellow. That PY150 really shining through. I love using this colour to mix greens. It makes really beautiful, natural looking earthy greens. Okay, next up we have the original Quin Gold, which is PO49. I do have a tube of this. It came as part of that big job lot of paints that I bought. So I got lucky with that one. I'm going to re-wet it there. See, it's not quite as like electrically bright as the newer version, which has that PY150 really does sort of shine through, and you can really see the subtlety in the wash of the original PO49. It's not hard to see why artists really enjoyed this colour. Okay, then we have Quinacridone Burnt Orange. This colour is beautiful, wet. I really love the hue of it when it's wet. Unfortunately, it is one of those colours that has quite a strong drying shift. So we'll see how it looks, but it's a beautiful mixer. And of course, drying shift can also be affected by the paper you're using, as well as the paint itself, of course. Next up we have a highly granulating colour, Lunar Earth. This one is very intensely granulating. It's PBR 11. Roman Schmall calls this colour Aquarius Brown. It's a really lovely earthy sort of colour. This is great for use in like abstracts or in landscapes, and it can create some really beautifully granulating fun mixes with other colours. Then we have Goethite, which Daniel Smith is made with PY43. This is a very sort of brown version of PY43 rather than like a yellow ochre type colour. This one's also very granulating and also very good in mixes. It's interesting, like it's not one I would have thought of to use much, but recently I included it on a palette and I found it great for mixing with yellows to get granulating yellowish mixtures, because it's not a super strong tinting strength, but it can mix really well with yellows to add granulation to those sorts of mixes. Okay, next up we have Burnt Sienna, a very classic PBR 7. I find Daniel Smith's Burnt Sienna is the most sort of pink in its undertone compared to other brands. A lot of brands have a very orange undertone Burnt Sienna, whereas I find Daniel Smith's one's very pink in its undertone. And you wash it out, you can see it's definitely got more of a pinkish hue coming through compared to some brands, that, especially brands that use PR101 for their burnt siennas. Although PBR7 can be various shades of colour. And then finally for this page we have Permanent Brown, PBR25, a very transparent, very strong red-brown colour. It's great for mixes. It's great as like an earth red, very strong earthy red colour. Okay. Next up we have Burnt Umber, PBR7 again. And this is usually a warm dark brown. If I was only going to have one brown on my palette, typically this is the one I would go for. Great for landscapes, great for mixing, just an all-round wonderful colour. I use it with a dark blue to mix some like darker greys and mix some good darks essentially. You can also add it into your greens to make them a bit more earthy. Then next up we have Raw Amber, also PBR7. This is a much cooler leaning brown, and I find I really don't like this colour. I really don't like this colour. I've never used it when it's been on a palette. I only have this pan of it because it came as part of the Jane Blundell Ultimate Mixing Set, which came with the set of tubes that I got from eBay, and every tube of this that was in that set as well I passed on. I sold it on to someone else who would use it, because it's not a colour I find much use for. There again, I prefer warmer browns, warmer... It's funny, with every colour on the colour wheel I prefer the warmer shades, other than blues. Blues I much prefer the cooler shades. It's interesting, I prefer warm yellows. Oh, I also prefer cool reds. So it's interesting, I prefer warm yellows, warm greens, warm purples, warm browns, but I prefer cool reds and cool blues. Fun fact. Next up we have Indian Red. This is a very opaque PR101, very sort of like brick red type colour. And again, this washes out to be a really lovely sort of pinkish undertone. It's very opaque in its mass tone. It's fairly granulating depending on the brand, and you can see this lovely sort of pinkish tone in the wash. I really love it. Next up we have Lunar Red Rock, which is another PR101. This one's also a granulating earth red. You can see it's very similar to that Indian Red in colour in the mass tone. See how similar they are in the wash. Again, the Indian Red, I don't have a tube of it. The pan came as part of that job lot that I got. And the Lunar Red Rock is very similar, to be fair. I think it might be slightly more granulating, but we'll see when it dries. Next up we have Quinacridone Burnt Scarlet, PR206. This is a pigment that is becoming discontinued, as is the PO48 that we talked about earlier, the Quinacridone Burnt Orange. This is another one that's beautiful and rich in its mass tone when wet, just in general, but it has quite the drying shift, at least the Daniel Smith one does. So it can end up looking quite muted and dull once it's dried. But again, it's beautiful in mixes. Next up we have Deep Scarlet, PR175. This is not a pigment I've come across in other brands, I don't think. I'm trying to remember now. If I have, I can't remember what they call it. But again, it's another really vibrant, rich, sort of earthier red colour. Next up we have Permanent Alizarin Crimson. The Daniel Smith version is made up with 3 pigments, PR177, PV19 and PR149. Alright, sorry, got cut off there, the battery ran out so I had to replace that. So same as Permanent Alizarin Crimson, PR177, PV19 and PR149. Original Alizarin Crimson is fugitive. It fades quite dramatically in direct light, so most brands offer a permanent version these days for artists who worry about light fastness. However, the Daniel Smith Permanent Alizarin Crimson has a bit of controversy around it because it includes the pigment PR177, which is what I'm now swatching on its own, which is Anthraquinone Red, which is a beautiful sort of pinkish red colour. And the reason is, this pigment is classified by most brands that offer it as being light fast. However, there has been some independent artists who have done their own light fastness testing and found this pigment to be potentially not light fast, or they found it to be not light fast, but obviously it depends, I don't know, it depends on your circumstances, I guess, the kind of sunlight you get, I'm not sure, but take that with a grain of salt for what you will. Do your own light fastness testing. If you're concerned about light fastness, I'd always recommend doing your own testing to make sure. But that's that one. And then next up, after Anthraquinone Red, we have Perylene Red, which is PR178. This is not a red I personally would have picked, probably. It was quite opaque, and of all the Perylene colours, this is not one of my absolute favourites, but it's one of the ones that came as part of that job lot, and so I kept it. Well, I think I kept like a half tube of it. Let's slide this along. Okay, so next up we have Pyrrole Scarlet, and that is the warm red that is included in Daniel Smith's essential mixing set of 6 paints. This is PR255. It's a very sort of classic warm red, sort of like a fire engine red almost, very sort of orange leaning. Again, not sort of colour I typically go for, but I know a lot of artists really like this colour. Then next up we have Rhodonite, which is one of what Daniel Smith refers to as their Primatech colours. So there was a bit of controversy around their Primatech range a while ago. I'm not going to get into it, you could probably search on YouTube to find out about that, but essentially it boiled down to the fact that maybe Daniel Smith aren't being super honest about what goes into these paints, but it's neither here nor there for right now. I only have a pan of this. Yeah, this is one of those colours that's like a very sort of light tinting rose colour, but it's also been known to fade in sunlight, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I've not done my own light fastness testing on this one, so I can't say for sure, but it's quite a fairly, it's not one I reach for, to be honest. It's not one that I enjoy that much. Then we have Quinacridone Fuchsia. This is PR202. Sometimes some brands call this one Quinacridone Magenta, but this is Quinacridone Fuchsia. This is a very heavy version of this pigment. It's quite like it feels heavy. I don't know how else to describe it. Like, it's quite opaque in its mass tone. It's very dull, in my opinion. It's not the nicest version of this colour, of this pigment. I'm not really a fan of PR202 in general. I just find it's a bit dull. It doesn't have that brightness that I'd want from a pink. Speaking of brightness, next up we have Quinacridone Rose, which is the cool red included in the Daniel Smith Essentials mixing set. This is a much brighter, much more sort of neon colour compared to the Quinacridone Fuchsia. This is PV19. Pretty much every brand has a variation on this Quinacridone Rose. Winsor & Newton call theirs Permanent Rose. It's usually some version of a rose in the name. Then we have Carmine, which is PR176. It's another one that I really like, a really nice sort of cool pinkish red. Whereas I would call Quinacridone Rose more like a magenta, Carmine is very much a pinkish red, or a pink leaning red, in my opinion. There again, colour is all relative. Next up we have Quinacridone Coral PR209. This is one of those pigments that's very intriguing to me because it's, again, it's relative to what you put next to it, but it can either read as a warm red or a cool red, and I find that really intriguing. It makes beautiful mixes, it makes beautiful sort of corally peachy colours when mixed with yellow. And yeah, I just find it really intriguing to mix with. And the PR209 is often in other brands, or in a lot of brands, PR209 is a quinacridone red. Daniel Smith also have a quinacridone red, which I believe theirs is a PV19 version. But this quinacridone coral is a very interesting and unique sort of red colour in my opinion. Like I said, compared to some of the, like the carmine and the quin rose, it looks a lot warmer, but in the wash it still looks very pink compared to the pyrrole scarlet. So it's very interesting in how it's how you perceive it. Then next up we have Quinacridone Lilac, and this is PR122. Now this is typically the pigment that most brands would call Quinacridone Magenta. So this is where having some sort of pigment knowledge is useful, because this hue of this PR122 is very much a magenta, quinacridone magenta colour by any other brand. So I believe Daniel Smith's quinacridone magenta is also PR202, same as quinacridone fuchsia. A slightly different shade of it, but you know, if you're following a tutorial and someone's using quinacridone magenta and it's this shade, it's this pigment and it's this shade, and then you get the Daniel Smith one and it's a lot duller, it's maybe closer to this colour, and you'll be like, well, why is my painting looking so different? I'm using the same colours. It might be the pigment's not the same. The colour name might be the same, but the pigment's not necessarily the same, which is why it's important to, in my opinion, it's important to know about pigments and to know what's in them and the properties of those pigments. But there again, for some people that's not important and you just want to enjoy your colours, and that's absolutely fine. You don't need to learn about pigments if you don't want to. I just find it enhances my painting experience, and then it allows me to colour mix with and know, or at least have an idea of what to expect from those mixes in terms of the paint properties. So for example, Rose of Ultramarine is a mixture of PB29, which is an ultramarine blue, and PV19, in this case probably quinacridone rose based on the name. And PB29, ultramarine blue or French ultramarine, is a granulating colour. So this paint will typically granulate. And that again, you know, comes down to understanding pigments and having that pigment knowledge, as it were. But there again, to each their own. I personally think it's important to know about it, or at least understand them. But that's, you know, everyone to their own. Next up we have Moonglow. This is a very sort of popular colour by Daniel Smith. It's a mixture of PG18, which is Viridian, which is granulating, PB29, that French ultramarine that we talked about, which is also granulating, and then PR177, which is that anthraquinone red with the questionable light fastness, which means that Moonglow has questionable light fastness. I've not personally had issues with it, but I know some people have had issues with Moonglow fading, or the red fading out of it and being left with more of the green and blue. But it's a really beautiful colour separating mixture, favoured by a lot of artists, and yeah, I enjoy using it a fair bit as well. Okay, I'm going to just add some drops of clean water into this Rose of Ultramarine, help it show off that separation and granulation. Okay, thought I'd quickly go over and show you the pages we've painted so far for the end of this video. So you can see here the buff titanium is showing up some granulation, as is the 4 sort of earthier yellows. The chrome titanate yellow has the mildest, it's not really showing up too much, but you can see a little bit in the wash here. And then the Mars yellow, yellow ochre and raw sienna all have a bit of granulation showing through. And then on the warmer side, we have the new gamboge. The Aussie red gold hasn't granulated on this paper. The Queen gold, the original Queen gold, you can see those differences there. I've also done a separate video comparing different brands of quinacridone gold to the original and all the different hues that are currently available. So I'll try and remember to leave a link to that video below. We have the PO48 quinacridone burnt orange, and then we have the lunar earth and goethite, which are very granulating colours. You can see that there. And then the burnt sienna and permanent brown, which don't the burnt sienna does granulate a little bit, but it's very mild. I'm not sure how well that's picking up on camera. And then we have the darker browns. We've got the burnt umber, raw umber, which granulate a bit, and then that Indian red and lunar red rock, which granulate a bunch as well. And then we have these other reds, which are all smooth colours, and onto the warm, like the cooler reds, the pinky colours. Again, no granulation here until we get to these last two colours here. Rose of Ultramarine and Moonglow definitely granulate and have some colour they colour separate more than granulate. So you can see the two different shades that make up Rose of Ultramarine. You can see the pink and the blue separating out in some of these areas where I've added extra water, and the same with the Moonglow. You can see the blues and the reds separating out in this swatch as well. Alright, that's it for part 1. Thank you for joining me for this one. If you are interested in seeing part 2, where we're going to swatch the blues and greens and the rest of the purples, then make sure to check out that one next. See you in a bit.